Good morning, everybody. We're starting a new mimer today, and we just finished preparations for Gimel Tammuz. Even though Gimel Tammuz didn't happen yet, but we're close in. We're going to start now preparations for Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz. First of all, do you know what Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz is? Everybody? Anyone?
When the Frierdiker kicked out of jail.
The Frierdiker Rebbe came out of jail, right? So there's quite a historic background to the days that we're approaching. You know, there's such things as Chassidic holidays. Reuven, you with me? Are you doing brachas? There's like the Chassidic holidays basically are in the annals of Chabad. There was certain miracles that took place in recent history, going back several hundred years up until present day, basically. And one such miracle was that the Frierdiker Rebbe was responsible for, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, the father-in-law of the Rebbe, was responsible for the world, as all the Rebbeim are. And in Russia, at that time, communism sort of set in such a way that they made it illegal to do most Jewish actions. And Judaism had to sort of go underground, and they started opening up underground schools and underground mikvahs and underground synagogues, and everything had to be, you weren't allowed to gather for any Jewish purposes. It was like extreme oppression. And it was his job to keep Yiddishkeit alive during this time. And what was worse is that there was Jewish agents of the communist wing, or a Jewish wing of the Communist Party. They were like the most anti-Semitic and the most anti-Torah. It's kind of like from within, they had the greatest evils. And so they, unfortunately, knew all the Jewish customs and they knew where the Jews were gathering and so forth. So it was like hellish conditions that we were being hounded from without and from within. And in the midst of all this, there was sort of one person who was operating the entire system in secrecy. This was the previous Rebbe, and finally they caught him, right? So in other words, the whole government was like trying to stomp this out, and they finally caught him. They put him in a severe jail situation. He wound up being beaten and tortured and basically disabled after he got out of there. He never really was the same again physically, but he did get out, and it was considered like a miracle on a grand scale. Like the way the Rebbe considered this miracle is like it was like greater than any miracles of the past, believe it or not. In other words, in general, you have to understand that there's miracles that are above nature and miracles that are in nature. And when we talk about miracles that are above nature, we usually talk about the splitting of the sea. People can't think of a greater miracle than that. That's sort of the poster child from miraculous, because just nature is just pushed away and God's obvious presence comes in. But we have an indication of a miracle from within nature, and this is the Purim story, right? And in the Purim story, it's famously known that Hashem's name is not even mentioned once, and there are no miracles outright that break the ways of nature, right? It's just like a kind of a political tale. And yet, it's well documented in Chassidus that the miracles of within nature, like the natural miracles, are actually come from a higher place and are actually a greater symbol of Hashem's mastery over the world than miracles which break nature. Does that make sense to anybody, or should we explain that a little bit further? I mean, I'm planning on explaining. I just want to know. Have you heard this concept before? Why are miracles that take place in a natural way considered to be of a higher order than miracles that break the nature and just like show Hashem's obvious presence? How could that even be? It's kind of similar to what we were speaking about in the last few classes, actually. What's that? Faith is a symbol of like, you're not seeing a miracle, but you believe. You're a believer. We're talking about miracles. The word nace even, right, comes from the word actually a pole. It means to raise up, which means something sticks out, and you can see like God's presence. So in the Purim story, there's no question that we could see God's presence. I mean, we celebrate Purim for thousands of years. It's a part of the Tanakh. It's obviously a miracle. No one's saying that it wasn't a miracle. It's just that this was a miracle where we didn't see nature break, right? So why is that a bigger nace, a greater presentation, a pole of God? What does it mean exactly from a blow to above? In other words, I'll agree with you, but what does that mean? It's kind of wrap it up in a...
Like supernatural miracles, like splitting of the sea.
Right.
And the plagues that Hashem brought out. Egypt, that's like Hashem bringing it down into the world, and it's like creates the world becomes even a different world. Like,
Okay.
And there's
What's that?
It was us that did it.
It was...
Like
no, Hashem brings all miracles.
Yeah, it was a miracle. We're saying it was God's
within
miracle.
the world.
Even
awakening from above from below to above, like he said.
But then it's worlds from miracles from within the world, and it's like brings out the I don't know the spirituality I don't know how to explain it, but
okay,
it goes the other way.
You're getting there.
It goes the other way.
Even the miracles of splitting the sea, one could argue, were like triggered by tzaddikim, right? Nachshon ben Aminadab walked in the sea. Moshe Rabbeinu was there. He had something to do with it, right? So, I mean, it's not so much that we did it or Hashem did it. Hashem makes miracles. But why is it considered a greater presentation, a greater force, a greater power of Hashem being revealed when the miracle is not breaking the nature and it's actually working with the nature? And the answer is actually very similar to what we were speaking in the last class, which is that when Hashem has to break nature in order to show his powers in this world, it shows that the nature itself is in some way opposing Hashem. Like Hashem is like an enemy, right? And it's nature, because nature is like this bully that wants it to go in its own way. And Hashem's like, I'll show you, bully, the sea will split right before you, right? So it's like, on one hand, that definitely shows the great power of Hashem, because it shows him being able to undo nature, but it also shows a tremendous weakness in Hashem, in a sense, that Hashem has to make a miracle. If you think about it, it does. Why? Because it shows that, like, in order for Hashem to have his way, he has to undo these fixed powers that seemingly are opposing him, the powers of nature, right? If Hashem isn't Hashem also the boss of nature, right? So how is it that Hashem has to come in and bully around this nature, which he himself is making it, right? So the idea is that when Hashem makes a miracle in nature, which means it is a miracle. There's no one saying that the story of Esther and Mordechai was not a miracle. It was completely, in a certain sense, such a thing could never happen, and that shows that it's miraculous. But what could never happen about it was not that the rules of nature were bent. It's just that nature itself wound up accommodating something that was completely unnatural. And so this is the idea that Hashem therefore shows his dominance, not only that he can override nature, but that he owns nature. And nature itself will do his bidding, even in a way which will save his people and bring forth his interests in the world and so forth. So that shows, why does it say it's similar to the Maimon we just learned? Because it's very much the concept of that there's not a singularity, and then over here there's a plurality, i.e. God and nature. And if you want God to come in, he has to undo and override the nature. No, the true nature of the essence of God is that he is both supernatural and natural. And therefore, how does he show you himself, his true self? How do you see Hashem's true self? Oh, not when you're seeing the supernatural. Because if you have to see the supernatural and he has to override the natural, then you're not seeing his true self. You're only seeing half of him. And if you're seeing only the natural and you're not seeing the supernatural, you're also only seeing half of him. Let's say the lower half, whatever. When you're seeing the supernatural happen, a miracle within the natural means that the nature is working to provide that miracle, that is the whole picture. You've got God in full. He's displaying himself, right? That nature is and above nature are both working and showing themselves as being of godliness. So all that is kind of a long-winded introduction to trying to explain to you the significance of the Rebbe getting out of jail. And why did I go through that whole thing? Because truthfully, if you're just sitting here hearing this for the first time, there's this conversation that there was a rabbi and he was imprisoned by the communists and he came out of jail. You're like, it's front page news for a day, but is that something we have to write Chassidic Maimarim about and make Jewish holidays about? And the answer is yes, because it was absolutely 100% unnatural. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The whole force of this, basically the biggest world power of the day, was coming to put itself squarely against Judaism and to wipe it out, and they got their man, right? And they had him incarcerated, and they were trying to do whatever they wanted with him. And if you read the story, which I really beg all of you to read, actually the previous Rebbe wrote diaries unbelievable like prose of autobiographical accounts of his life. It's like one of the things that we don't have that from any of the other Rebbeim. It's like a personal story is written in like the first person from the Rebbe himself, and he describes in detail all of the crazy tale that took place of him being incarcerated and him being in the prison and the type of response and attitude that he had towards the prisoner. He basically made like a firm resolve as soon as he realized what was happening that he's not going to give them like the time of day. And he stood against them as though they didn't even exist. Like they would even speak to him and he would respond to them in Yiddish, like a language they didn't ever understand. He like gave them zero respect, zero like room that they even existed. He just kind of blocked it. It was a crazy thing to do to like people who were holding a gun to your head. And somehow, through way of miracle, not only did he somehow override this whole craziness, but they wound up letting him out. And they didn't just let him out, they sort of let him out with like great fanfare. And ultimately the Rebbe explained in no uncertain terms that when the previous Rebbe came out of prison, this was the beginning of a bigger miracle, which was also the fall of the entire communism. And when like the wall came down and communism ended in the late 80s, the Rebbe, had been explaining that this was going to happen. First of all, he prophesied that like many, many years earlier. And he always connected it to the fact that my father-in-law really already began this process. Because once he came out and like, he showed them to be powerless and empty because they got their man, and he basically just like walked out like almost like Avram Avinu from the fire, So this is in fact one of the great miracles of our time. This is something that the Rebbe considered to be like a sign of God's absolute like protection and clear presence in the life of the Jewish people, even in the modern era. And so every single year, since that release, there is something called the great holiday of Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz. Yud Beis and Yud Gimel. And the story goes, right, so it actually, I'm going to attack even in one more day, which is Gimel Tammuz. Gimel Tammuz was actually a holiday in the previous generation. We now, so to speak, celebrate Gimel Tammuz as the Rebbe's Yortzeit, the Shabbos. But the truth is that the day of Gimel Tammuz was already a significant day in the Jewish calendar because of its connection with this story of the previous Rebbe. So the story goes that on the 15th of Sivan, they incarcerated him. As I told you, it was like this hellish thing. He describes it as the 7 gates of Gehenna. There's 7 gates to hell, basically. And as the Friedrich Rebbe is explaining his experience and describing it to you in great detail, all what happened to him, it's like gate 1, gate 2, he's just like being brought down into like, right to the end of his life practically. In any case, on the Gimel Tammuz, that's when they took him out of the prison and they decided to send him to exile. Right, so it was kind of like a day which began the redemptive process. In fact, the Rebbe called this day of Gimel Tammuz his Chalta de Geula, the beginning of the redemption. Not right because it's very like poignant that wound up becoming his Yurtzeit, and then the meaning of the fact that day is called the beginning of the redemption is insane when you put it in context of what it became. But even before that, it was called the beginning of the redemption because that was the day he came out of prison and he was sent to a place called Kostroma, which is like in the middle of nowhere. They exiled the Friedrich Rebbe. That was like instead of killing him, which was his original decree, he actually saw this form of paper when he was sitting in like the government offices, and it said like his name, and it said execution, and it was crossed out, and it said 10 years in exile, and it was crossed out, and then it said 3 years in exile and to Kostroma. So he packed his bags, went to Kostroma. I don't think he had too many bags with him actually, and he was there from Gimel Tammuz. He was supposed to be there for 3 years. On the 12th of Tammuz, which is his birthday, he was informed that he was going to be released. So like instead of being killed within quick chick-chock, he was also going to be, but since that day, the 12th of Tammuz was a Russian holiday, the official offices were closed, he had to wait till the 13th of Tammuz to actually come out with the official stamp of the government and so forth. And so it became that the 12th and the 13th of Tammuz, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz, for all eternity became a holiday like at the level of Purim. In other words, it's a miracle that came through nature. And so you'll see, we celebrate already Gimel Tammuz, and then Yud Beis Tammuz, and Yud Gimel Tammuz. So coming up soon is some major festivities, and we'll forbring about this at much greater length. This was sort of just like an introduction because we're about to learn a mimer to prepare ourselves for Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, and I see that not everybody knows what it is. So it's definitely important to realize like why, and in what context the Rebbe was saying this mimer, right? Celebrating what he considered to be the greatest of all the holidays, because it was his Rebbe's release. It was like his like the Yetzias Mitzrayim, which gave us the generation that we have. Okay, so with no further ado, that was a lot of ado. We're going to start this mimer. It's from the year the Rebbe said this was 1969. Was this year? It was a double parsha, Chukas Balak, and this is a primary about Chukas. So I kind of wanted to start it at least at the end of this week. This will be our last class this week, but we're going to be continuing this with this mimer and probably until Yud Beis Tammuz. It's a little bit long. So we'll get it in. It's a Chukas mimer basically, but so we'll start it now in Parshas Chukas. So he says, "V'yidaber Hashem el Moshe, zos Chukas haTorah." Hashem says to Moshe, "This is the statute, thank you, of the Torah." And it says, "Vayicho elecha paraduma." It should sound familiar. This phrase, "Vayicho elecha." We've been talking about it last week, but it's a different thing. They're not bringing him olive oil. They're bringing to Moshe the paraduma, the red heifer. Uperush Rashi, "Vayicho elecha." Rashi says, what does it mean they bring it to you? What is the Torah indicating by saying specifically they're going to bring it to you? Liyolam hi nikres al shemecha. And it's kind of an interesting learning that they get out of here. Bring it to you comes to teach us that this will always be called by your name. Para sha'asa Moshe b'midbar. In other words, this is Moshe's cow. Even though it's called Zos Chukas HaTorah, it's the red heifer, it's whatever, it's the cow. But it's really, because it says they were going to bring it to you, when really we're going to soon see Moshe didn't really have much to do with it actually. Right? He didn't make it, he wasn't involved in it so much, but nonetheless it's called by his name. But tzrich lahavi. Why? Harirak par rishon asa Moshe. Even if you want to say Moshe was involved in it, only the first one, right? There was how many red heifers were there in history? The first 9. There was 9 so far, right? Do you know what the red heifer is? You know what it's there for, everybody? Yeah. You familiar with this idea? Purification. From the dead, right? From Tumas Mace. Okay. So Moshe made one, right? But he only made one. He only made the first one. Lama nikras kola paras. Why are all the paradumas, like the mitzvah and the concept of paraduma, why is it called on Moshe's name? Shmonas parashasu achar kach. Both the 8 that were made after Moshe's, v'gam para asiris shiasa melech HaMashiach, and also the 10th one, which will be made by Mashiach. It's also going to be called on Moshe's name. Wait, why? Soon. What's that? Soon. Lahosif ta'al pia yedua. According to what's known, Shmo shel kol davar asher yikru lo mora al inyanu b'tochana. There's a basic concept brought in Tanya that the name of everything refers to its essence. In other words, there's a concept in Judaism that letters have an absolute, not a relative, but an absolute connection with the things that they're called with. In every other language, if you want to call this thing something, you call it a cup. How do you say cup in another language? Spanish. Anyone speak Spanish?
Taza or vaso.
Okay, either of those. What is it? Dasa?
Taza or...
So let's say it's dasa. What makes this dasa?
T-A-Z-A.
Tasa. Tasa, cup. Of course, I remember from my high school years. Tasa. What makes it a tasa? Is anything essentially tasa about this cup? Or is anything cup about this cup? Does it have to do with this actual object, or is it just basically relative? There you go. The cup. Okay, well, you probably never thought about it because it's just a crazy idea, right? Because really, the only reason this is a cup or a tasa is because we agree that it is. We basically have like this whole world of objects, and I need a hammer, you need a nail. So basically, we label things in a community and agree on what to call it, so that we have basically a system of operating. But the names that we use have nothing to do with the actual thing itself. Other than that, it's just an agreed upon name. That's why in Spanish you call it this, in English you call it this. Neither of those names have anything to do with the thing itself. It's just the agreed upon community that needs to identify. So we grab a word. But in the Lashon HaKodesh, right, this is something like amazing and unique. According to what it says in the Tanya, according to Kabbalah, God created the world with letters. In other words, language is not just something agreed upon and subjective. The Hebrew language is essential. And the shape of the letters and the meaning of the letter, we just read it these last couple of days in our daily Tanya, that the gematria of the letters, right, and the combination of different letters, they actually create things. So the fact that this is a kos is not just an agreed upon reality that we all just need something to call it. On the contrary, it is that, and therefore we call it that because we were told its true name. And we find like the source of this concept in the Torah itself, when it says that right in the beginning of the creation story, Hashem brought all the animals to Adam Arishon to name them. It's like a peculiar, like weird thing. Like of all the things you're going to tell us in just like the first few chapters of which is supposed to describe the entire beginning of existence, it's like Adam is created, and then he like names all the animals. It's just kind of this random thing. And how did he know their names, right? So it's like, it's so weird, you know? But according to, the deeper meaning, it's in order to explain to us the awesome level that Adam Arishon was on. Hashem made a man with his own hands, so to speak. He wasn't born of a woman. He was like the most perfect creation that ever was. So much so that he was able to look at the creation and see the divine letters that were enlivening it. And that's what he means he named all the animals. He didn't give them names. He called them by their actual name, right? And this is like an amazing thing. So from here we learn this basic concept, and this is true about everything in Lashon HaKodesh. Its name is its essence. And so here we're bringing this point out to explain that the fact that Rashi says, Vayikcho Elecha, means that this cow was called on Moshe's name, is not just a small thing. It means just because the name of a thing represents the very essence of what the thing is. Move on, it's understood. This that all the cows were called on Moshe's name. It's because this connection to Moshe is what they're all about. In other words, there's like, the paraduma is Moshe. That's what it means it's called by his name. Whatever Moshe is and whatever his name represents and his being is, that's why they called the paraduma by the name Moshe, because their concept is one. According to this, we have to understand further. The fact that these cows are called on Moshe's name, right? Moshe didn't seemingly have much to do with it. The cows were made by the Kohanim. The first one was made by Elazar HaKohen. It wasn't made by Moshe. And what does it mean? Moshe. So why does it Rashi say it's called in his name? Because this is the cow that Moshe made in the desert. He didn't make it. Seemingly, it's just because he gave the command and he gave the instruction to make it. So the question is, where do they get this? Where do they get off being one with Moshe? They're called by his name, spiritually meaning that they are the same as him, right? When he really had very seemingly little to do with it in the first place. Okay, that's the first chapter. Beis. Yes, please.
Do we know what, like, if Adam Harishon named all the animals, what language would that have been in?
That's what I was trying to say. It must have been in, of course, yeah. Well, first of all, we were actually told that in the Torah that the world was created in Lashon HaKodesh. Because it says, for this reason she's called Isha, Kimi Ish Lukacha. It's because she was taken from the Ish. Okay. So in other words, like because the world was created in Hebrew and she was made from Ish, that's why she's called Isha. It's like, in other words, she like took over his like identity with a hey on the end. Mm-hmm. So yeah, until the Tower of Babel, you know the story of the Tower of Babel? So there was only one language, and we're also told that in the Torah. It says that the people had one language, right? Amecha, they were like one people with one language, and it was only at the Tower of Babel where they actually used that language to build a big tower and go against Hashem that Hashem got angry, and he made the 70 languages like at one shot. So it's very kind of like a mystical, deep thing. I mean, this is like one of those places where science and history has to just basically take a page out of our book. But like as far as the Torah is concerned, all 70 languages happened instantaneously in like a moment's time. That all of a sudden, and it was a punishment really for man, because so they couldn't go on and build. So before that time, every single thing and everybody spoke Hebrew. And then it fell out of practice. It became, so it was like this like sort of unique quality to know the Holy Tongue. And we find this because it's like later on, not too much later on, but later on in history, when Yosef was brought to Mitzrayim, and he was basically dueling it out with Paro. I don't know if you know the story, but like he was trying to, explain to Paro like his greatness, because he was interpreting his dreams, and he was then like sort of being put to the test of whether he would be able to rule. They were trading languages because the kings had to know all the languages in order to be a king. Like you were trained in the finest schools. They knew that, so Paro knew 70 languages. And Yosef also knew 70 languages. He didn't really know them. It says that Gabriel came and like knocked him on the head and gave him this power of 70 languages. And then it says he knew one language more than Paro, because he knew Hebrew. Because I guess at that time it was not like such a well-known thing. Like the Bnei Yisrael learned it, and it was like learned in the tents of Shem and Aver. It was like once the languages sort of overtook everybody, then we became the ones who like preserved the true religion, so to speak, the true language. So Paro made him swear that he wouldn't reveal that he knew another language, because if so, he was supposed to be king. Yeah. In any case, that's the story. So, Beis, ha'inyan hu, Yisa b'Lekutei Torah. It's brought in Lekutei Torah from the Alter Rebbe. Da'atam al zeh shepara aduma nemar zos chukas haTorah. Why is this particular mitzvah called "This is the statute of the Torah"? In other words, it's calling it out and singling it out as though it has some kind of a status greater or more significant than all the other mitzvahs, because it says this is the statute of the Torah, and it's referring just to the one mitzvah. So why is that? Hu lefi shemitzvahs paraduma hi klalos haTorah. It's because there's something about this particular mitzvah which contains inside of it the whole Torah. We say that about other mitzvahs, but not any other mitzvah has this quality. The Torah itself says this is the whole Torah. Zos chukas haTorah. So there's something in it which somehow symbolizes or contains within it all the other mitzvahs of the Torah. And therefore, Kamosha, Torah nikras al shemo shel Moshe. So now we have an easy answer to what we just asked. Just like the Torah in general is called on Moshe's name, as the pasuk says in Malachi, Zichru Torahs Moshe Abdi. Remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant. So Hashem himself calls the Torah Moshe's Torah. So we see that the Torah itself is called on Moshe's name. So therefore, automatically then the Paraduma, which we just got through saying is the whole Torah, right? It must be called on Moshe's name. If the Torah is Moshe's name and the Paraduma is Moshe, then the Paraduma is the Torah. Then the Paraduma is Moshe. So it has to be called in his name. We could add that it says in Lekutei Torah that the mitzvah Paraduma is the general concept of Torah. Right? So when we say Zos Chukas Torah, and inside of the Paraduma, it's all of Torah, we don't necessarily mean it's all of the understanding of Torah. Right? Torah in general kind of contains two things, Torah and mitzvahs. Right? The Torah is the explanation and like the intelligence behind the wisdom behind the mitzvahs. But then there's when you have the 613 mitzvahs, that's also called Torah. So when we say Zos Chukas Torah, and it's referring to a mitzvah called the Paraduma, then when we say this is the general inyan of Torah, we mean it's the general inyan of mitzvahs, right? That all mitzvahs are basically contained and held inside of this one mitzvah, Zos Chukas Torah. And as the Alter Rebbe explains, what is it about the Paraduma which basically has this poster child quality of being all the mitzvahs in one? And over there he says it's because the general concept of the Paraduma is that it has the secret of the mitzvahs, which is called Ratzov V'Shov. What does it mean, Ratzov V'Shov? Ratzov V'Shov?
Forward and back.
Running and returning, forward and back, right?
Returning.
It says in the prophecies of the chariot, right, that Yecheskel, he saw the angels running and returning. And this notion of running and returning is this principle that's built into everything, your heartbeat, like the tides, right? Like even like matter itself. And of course, according to Yiddishkeit and Kabbalah, literally existence itself is in a state of running and returning. Where Hashem is like projecting all of existence every instant and then removing it and projecting it again. This is like really where the concept of time comes from. Really, there's just like eternality. But Hashem created it in such a way that he like projects it, pulls it back, projects it. So that's what it means that he's mechadesh b'chol yom tami ma'aseh b'reishis. He's constantly bringing forth all of existence from his speech, because the energy of existence is running and returning. So in mitzvahs themselves, there's a notion that the mitzvahs themselves are called running and returning. That's also we have positive mitzvahs and negative mitzvahs, but also in each mitzvah, even in the positive and negative themselves, the concept of mitzvah bears this notion of running and returning, which I'll explain in a minute. And that is the reason why all the mitzvahs are likened to the paraduma, that the paraduma is like the poster child for the whole concept of mitzvahs, because paraduma shows on running and returning in a very clear and obvious way. Running and returning is, like you said, up and down, or forward and back, up and down. In general, the running is compared to fire. Because fire's job is it's trying to get off the wick and like go back to its source. That's right. So that's what it means. Like it's like in a state of running to return to oneness. And then water is the symbol of returning, right? Because the water's nature is to always find the lowest place, right? Wherever you're going to put water, it's going to drown until it gets to the bottom. So it's the Indian of return. So fire and water are opposites. Running and returning, therefore, is compared to fire and water. And the paraduma mitzvah, how do you make a paraduma? You burn it up, right, which is the fire, and then you mix it with water, right? So the fact that this is a mitzvah, which is like is a mitzvah of fire and water, means it is a symbol of running and returning, and that's why it's the poster child of all mitzvahs, because all mitzvahs are running and returning. Now, what does it mean, running and returning? In a more practical sense that we can relate to, is the idea of, exactly as I said, like the running is the need for us to get out of this place, right? In other words, we are like a flame. The Jewish people, we spoke about it in the yesterday's mimer. It says Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the flame of God is our soul. So your soul is like a flame. It's actually, that's why it says the Jews like shuckle when we daven. We like our flame sort of gets going, and we're just like a flame on a wick, right? And the idea is that what are we trying to get away from? Why is our soul trying to get out of our body? And in general, why is the creation trying to run back into Hashem once it was created? It's because the feeling of self is contrary to truth. Because really, all there is God. So when your soul comes out from the place where it was rooted in pure oneness of God, and Hashem, for whatever reasons He wants a dwelling place in the lowest worlds, He sticks it down into your body. So the soul is like all of a sudden inside of a beast, an animal who's going around like eating hay and like mooing, right? The soul's like, get me the heck out of here. This is not where I belong at all. Like, what did you do to me? It's unnatural, right? It's like contrary to truth, I think is what I said, right? And so this is why a Jew, the first thing he does in the morning is daven. Because if you don't daven, right, officially there's a halacha that says you're not allowed to eat before you daven, right? There's in our generation, whatever the Rebbe said, maybe it's good to have something to eat so you can daven with some strength. But in general, there's a principle you don't eat before you daven. Why is that? Because the whole purpose of eating is to elevate the food, is to bring the world into you when you consume it, and you're on a higher level than the food. Quite literally and physically, like in materialism, you take a hamburger and you chew it and digest it, and it becomes eventually blood, which is now running in the body of a human being. And the human being is a Jew in this case, and he's therefore connecting to God. So what did you just do? You just took a hamburger and connected it to God. This is the secret behind animal sacrifices, by the way. In the animal sacrifice, there was salt, either wine or flour, and animal, which is basically the three elements of reality: inanimate, growing, and animal, right? And so each sacrifice had to have all three of those agents. And the idea is that when you offered an animal sacrifice, it was like davening. That's why we daven in place of the sacrifices. This is why. This is the connection. Because they would take the physical world, a representative from each part of the physical world, and they would use it in the divine service. So all the physical world was therefore elevated into a divine service. And therefore, the materialism of the world became godly. When you eat, the same thing is supposed to happen. Just like when Hashem eats, it's called Hashem's bread. Right? Lachmi. We just spoke about it yesterday in the Creative Torah. We're going to say it again. Right? That the food on the altar is called Hashem's food. Why? Why is it called food? Hashem eats? What is this? It's because it's a metaphor for what happens when someone eats, is that you take the material and you transform it into a higher being. And so this animal sacrifices would transform the existence into godliness. So when you are going to go ahead and eat, the purpose of your eating is to elevate the world. But if you yourself have just woke up, and your soul basically was just thrust into a body, and you have not yet sort of realized that who you are, you think you yourself are an animal when you just wake up, right? You haven't opened your spiritual mind. You haven't learned an hour of Chassidus yet, right? And so therefore, who said that when you eat, you're going to elevate the food? Yeah, you might elevate the chicken into a man, but you yourself are acting like a chicken. You didn't bring it up into godliness. And therefore, you're not allowed to eat before you daven, because when you daven, you basically bring your soul to the table. And now I can eat something. Now when I eat it, it's going to be used for Torah. It's going to be used for divine meditation. It's going to be used for mitzvahs, right? So this is the concept. So the point here is that davening is like running, right? When we need to get out of here. Because if you just wake up and before you meditate, before you daven, before you realize who you are, your soul has come from this heavenly abode and it's been thrust into a state of total disconnect. And therefore the instinct of a yid is I have to get up and daven. I have to basically run back to the source. And this is called running, right? This is what it means from the running and returning. So running means you're going basically, in our previous conversation, from the plurality to the singularity. Trying to get out of like separateness and like animal-mindedness back into oneness. So that's the beginning of every mitzvah, is connected with that. Because if you go to do a mitzvah, you're allowing the reality that you are not part of this regular world. Why are you going putting on tefillin? Is that part of your morning yoga workout? No, this is like a divine thing, which I am clearly running outside of the bounds of nature and connecting myself to something higher. So in every mitzvah, there's this notion of running out of the mundane reality to join into the will of Hashem. But then there's a returning aspect of the mitzvah. Why? Because each mitzvah is different. One mitzvah goes on your head, one mitzvah goes in your arm, one mitzvah goes in your hand, one mitzvah goes in your brain, right? So it's like you're basically bringing that divine energy back into the world and filling the world and making it a home for Hashem. So each mitzvah has this dual nature, where on one hand it gets you out of your animalistic self to like sort of reach higher ideals, but then you're doing something physical with the mitzvah, and therefore you're bringing those higher ideals back down and returning them into the world and making a dwelling place for Hashem. And since the para aduma is literally fire and water, so it represents the concept of running, getting out of this place, burning the animal up, and then pouring water on it and bringing it back down more than any other mitzvah. Therefore, it represents the whole Torah. Got it? Now, what did we establish? Since the para aduma, when we said it's the general, it is the Torah. We really said it. Now we understand it. It means it's the mitzvahs. It's all the mitzvahs. So now we have one more little piece of the puzzle. That when we say it's called on Moshe's name, it means that Moshe is also connected with the general concept of mitzvahs. Not only is the Torah called Moshe, but we see now that all the mitzvahs are called Moshe. If the paraduma is called Moshe, right, and the paraduma is all the mitzvahs, then the mitzvahs are also called on Moshe's name. Now let's explain all this based on what it says in Tanya. That Tammuz shetziva Moshe Rabbeinu l'dor shenichnasu la'aretz likros kriyas shema pam b'ayim b'chol yom. What is the reason that Moshe Rabbeinu commanded to his generation that was going to enter Eretz Yisrael to read Shema twice a day, right, or to say the Shema twice a day? Lekabel malchus shemayim mesiras nefesh. And what's the idea of the Shema? This is highlighted mostly like in the Shema of Yom Kippur, where it actually says in the Siddur that you should close your eyes and imagine yourself giving your life to God. But really, in a sense, that's the Shema of every day. That's why we close our eyes. We're like, there is no world here. When you say Shema, you're receiving upon yourself the kingdom of heaven with mesiras nefesh, to the point that you're like willing to die. That's like a key factor of saying the Shema, right? The idea is that Hashem Elokeichem Emes, the idea is that the Shema ends with this notion of being brought out of Mitzrayim, which is basically being brought out of the goof and being willing to leave all limitations to just go crazy into God. So why did Moshe command the Jewish people, according to the Tanya, to say the Shema twice a day, to have willingness to die for God? Even though there was always already a promise that was given the fear of the Jews would be upon all of our enemies, and we weren't actually going to have Mesiras Nefesh, right? As we also spoke about in the last Maimer, that in the days of Moshe, he was not able, remember we said he was not able to really be the Raya Mehemna that Mordechai was, because there was no one trying to kill the Jews, right? Basically Hashem was protecting them in a supernatural way all through the desert. So why therefore would they have to say Shema and present a willingness to give their lives for God as though their lives were at stake when they really weren't? They were being divinely protected. And he says in the Tanya a very, very, very powerful message, which is something we could bring him on for hours. It's because the entirety of keeping Torah mitzvahs depends upon a Jew's reminding himself that he's willing to die for Hashem. This is a very, very important point. This is actually like the central theme of the Rebbe's first Maimer and the previous Rebbe's last Maimer. This piece of Tanya is extremely important to understand. Why is it so that when a person, in order to be just a regular Jew who's doing Torah mitzvahs, why do you have to remember that you'll be willing to die for God if the opportunity arose? Because the truth is that you would, right? It's something strange about us, but it's not something that you necessarily learned anywhere. Like as we spoke about in the previous Maimer, there's something implicit about a Yid that when push comes to shove, if he realizes that in this next action he's truly going to cut himself off from the God of Israel, he would give his life. He can't help it. It's his nature. Why is it remembering that so desperately important that without it, you really can't keep any of the other Torah mitzvahs?
Because by having the will to die for God, you're showing that essentially God, divinity, is more important than like the material world that you're in. So when you recognize that God trumps materialism and everything around you, you're then recognizing that importance and putting an emphasis on that above everything else, and then having that, it becomes much easier. It becomes a principle to connect to God and everything you do.
Beautiful. It becomes much easier.
It illustrates the self-unification.
But I think you hit right on it
But
there.
you're also not separating yourself from Hashem. So Hashem's will is still also your will, and you're not like having your own. You're not putting your own decision on things. It's just Hashem, what Hashem wants.
Right. The idea being like this: you're going to come across a situation where, there's going to be a test. It could be a small test, like. You just started keeping kosher and all your friends are going out to a restaurant and you're like, well, I'm not going to eat the meat, but maybe I'll have a little side dish of salad. I don't know, the plates, maybe it's not such a big deal. So you have a test, right? Should I keep kosher or not? So here you feel like you're wrestling with something very difficult. Like there's like social pressure and is God even, all of a sudden you start asking, is the Torah even true? Like, what I'm saying? You get into this whole thing. And then all of a sudden, you close your eyes, say Shema, realize that you would die for God, literally, and like your forefathers and have, right, like repetitively throughout the generations, and you would too if it came to it. So all of a sudden you realize, like, how big of a deal is this, right? I would literally die for God. I can hold off on the restaurant. It's literally that simple. You need to, that's why you said it right. It makes it easier. It's imperative to realize your commitment, because you're not inventing this commitment. You already have this commitment. You would die for God. It's true. It's proven throughout history. And it's not the great scholars, by the way, that gave their lives for God. It was oftentimes very simple Jews that just were like, put their foot down. They're not going to have this nonsense. They'll die if it comes down to that, right? We all have it in us. So if you remember that, you're not going into that restaurant. You're like, are you kidding me? I would die before I go into that restaurant. And so this is something essential in just being a simple Jew, right? And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu had the Jews in the Midbar ready to die for God, even though they mamish did not have to die for God. It was like told to them by Moses himself, you're not going to be in any trouble here. You're protected. You'll never get to a situation where someone's going to try and kill you because you're Jewish. And nonetheless, he made them close their eyes twice a day and remember that they're ready to die for God. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to do any of the other mitzvahs. You need to remember the core of who you are. Right? And so he says, V'yesh lomar, Dezeh Moshe dafka tziva zeh l'dor shenichnas la'aretz hu. What's the reason that Moshe gave this command to that generation who was going to come into Eretz Yisrael? Ki mesiris nefesh hu inyan bittul. And this is what Ruvi was saying. That mesiris nefesh, which right, we've translated that term enough times. You guys know what that means, right? The willingness to die for God, giving over your soul. This is what it really means is bittul. Bittul means self-nullification. Like you're ready to not be. Bittul is like I'm ready to hold back my desires of going into the restaurant. But real bittul is I'm ready to just take me out of here. I'm so like you are so much more significant than I am. I'm ready to step aside my existence for yours.
Nefesh, I think is animal soul, right? The ability to move, to eat, to have children, to walk around the world, to see.
Yeah. In the most exact sense, yeah.
Like the whole being as we see in us being right now.
So this is why did he tell them that we're going into the land? They had to say the Shema and have this mysterious nefesh because it's an inyan of bittul, self-sacrifice. Since a person naturally is not bittul, he's very much a self, and he has his own ideas, and he has his own opinions, and he has his own emotions, and he has his, everything is I, which is the opposite of bittul, because Hashem made us that way. Therefore, in order for this quality of Mesiris Nefesh to really be shown by him, and not just that he has it, but it's fixed in his heart continuously, Yomam v'layla, day and night, lo yamish mizichrono, and never leaves his mind. You need a special empowerment. In other words, to give the feeling of your Jewish essence over to a regular old Tom, Dick, and Harry Jew, it's really quite a feat to pull off because we are totally selfish and like have our own interests at hand, like at the ready. So to all of a sudden like be reminded, and not just reminded, but day and night continuously that you're willing to die for God, you need a super duper empowerment to sort of like get that straight in your head all the time. And this Nesinas Koach, this empowerment is by none other than our fearless leader, Moshe Rabbeinu. He has to be the one empowering us with this. Ki Moshe hu inyan habitul. Why? Because Moshe is that. See, for us, it's very counterintuitive to give our lives for God. But for Moshe, that's natural. That's what he is 24/7 all the time. He is the ultimate Jew. Because his like external animalistic self is just so thin that it's like barely even there. It's just something to hold his godliness in a place on earth. But he is just all Jew all the time, ready to do all the mitzvahs and die for Hashem at every second. So he's the one that has to sort of remind the little Moshe inside of us that he's there. Moshe represents Nachnu Ma, right? It says regarding Moshe, he and Aaron, he calls us, what are we? Which you could say as a question, you could say as a statement. We are what? Like we are zero. That's how they saw themselves. Therefore, since Moshe was the one who issued the order for this generation to accept upon themselves the Mesiris Nefesh, twice a day, through this, he empowered them to remember continuously that they themselves have Mesiris Nefesh. It's like he gave them a little bit of his essence by issuing them an order. When you see a Moshe Rabbeinu, when he comes to you and he says, you do this, you bring yourself to my level, so it empowers you. Suddenly you can do it too, and you can remember that when the test comes out. And that's what it means, Liolam hi nikras al shemecha, that the paradum will always be called on your name. Because the kiyum Torah mitzvah, the fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs, which the paraduma is the Torah mitzvahs, we've established, it all depends on the remembering of the inyan of Mesiris Nefesh, and the power to remember continuously the inyan of Mesiris Nefesh comes through Moshe, and don't forget, his extension in every generation. In other words, none of us ever saw Moshe. So how are we going to get that empowerment? So because we have the Moshe of our times. Maybe none of us ever saw him either. But nonetheless, he's right behind the curtain. It's not some 4,000-year-old man. And the idea is that this is why, right, the paraduma has to be called on Moshe's name. The paraduma represents Torah mitzvahs. And Torah mitzvahs, right, requires your having Mesiris Nefesh. We just established that. And the power to remember that you have Mesiras Nefesh comes through Moshe and his extension in every generation. The Rebbe says clearly, Ad Kavod Kedushas Mor V'Chamei Admor Nasi Doreinu Baal Simcha B'Geula. Up the Moshe of the generation, right up until my father-in-law, who was the leader of the generation, who's the one whose day we're celebrating right now. Right? So in other words, you're getting the point. It's like, why is the Paraduma called by Moshe's name? We're getting a definitive answer right now. Because the Paraduma is mitzvahs. And mitzvahs must be done with Mesiras Nefesh, or you're not going to do them. And therefore we have to call mitzvahs, right, the Paraduma, by Moshe's name, because Moshe represents bittul and a willingness to sacrifice yourself and give everything you have over, because there is no mitzvahs unless you remember that all the time. And therefore the Paraduma, i.e. mitzvahs, are called Moshe. Because you need Moshe in order to, you need the Moshe inside of yourself, the total self-sacrifice in order to do them at all. V'yesh lomar, and we'll just conclude here. The al yidei she'avodaso shel nasi dureinu b'chol meshech shloshim shanos nesiyuso ha'isa b'sniras nefesh b'giloi, and we can say that since we saw, the Rebbe speaking about his father-in-law, we saw this Rebbe live in a state of absolute and utter Mesiras Nefesh for the entire 30 years that he was Rebbe, right? From 40 to 70. And basically, that's why I told the story in the beginning. You have to understand like what this person took on the entire weight of all of communism that killed more Jews than Hitler, Yimach Shemo. And he like stood face to face the eye of the 7 gates of Gehenna. And I'm Moshe, like you're not going to, I'm not even listening to you. You don't even exist. Like this, you have to read the story. It just melts any Jew. So as we saw this, we saw a person living 24/7 in a state of total self-nullity. Therefore, the empowerment on the remembering of the Mesiras Nefesh that comes from the extension of Moshe in every generation is even more than it was in the times of Moshe. Very, very similar than we said in the last Mimer. That the later Rebbes who had to deal with greater oppression, they naturally had to show a state of Mesiras Nefesh more than, let's say, Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe was ready to do whatever God said, but no one ever put Moshe Rabbeinu in Stalin's worst prison. So he didn't have to do what God said even there. So when we saw a person, when we saw Moshe's qualities come out like that, it empowers us even more. It makes it, I'm for sure not going to that restaurant. You won't even touch a hair of my beard. Like, right? It's like we got totally empowered from like this super ferocious Jew, and we realized that he's empowering us. We have the same thing. And therefore, now you can do the mitzvahs, right? Because they have to be called by Moshe's name. Paraduma. Tov. Okay, that's a wrap.